I want to start with the silence. Not the silence before she said it, the silence after. The 4 seconds between my wife telling a federal courtroom that I was a man who had never built anything worth respecting, and the moment the arbitrator across the table set down his pen, looked at the folder in front of him, and said, "Counselor, I don't think you've read the exhibit list. 4 seconds. I have replayed those 4 seconds more times than I can count, because in them I didn't move. I didn't look at Diane, or at her attorney, or at my own daughter, sitting in the second row with her arms crossed like she already knew how this was going to end. I looked at the arbitrator, and he looked at me, and something passed between the two of us that I can only describe as one man quietly recognizing another. Not as a name, not as money. As someone who had done something real and gotten no credit for it until exactly that second. Then he opened the folder wider and said, "Mr. Whitfield, would you like to explain to your client what her husband actually owns?" And Diane's attorney's face went the color of old paper. Buckle in, because this one starts in a conference room, and it ends in a conference room, and everything between those 2 points is the story of a man who spent 19 years building something enormous, while the person who shared his bed called it a hobby. She said that, on the record, in front of a court reporter. She should have checked first. If you're new here, hit subscribe and ring the bell, because what came out of that folder is not the kind of thing that happens by accident. It happens when a man gets underestimated for 2 decades and finally stops correcting people quietly. Stay with me on this one. My name is Russell Combs. I'm 66 years old, and I live outside Terre Haute, Indiana, on a piece of land my father left me. In a house, I built additions onto myself, room by room, over about 15 years, whenever I had a free weekend. I'm not a scientist. I never went past 2 years of community college, and I dropped out of that to go work with my hands. What I am is a machinist and a toolmaker. And for the last 31 years, I've run a small precision shop out of a pole barn behind my house, making parts for people who needed something exact and couldn't get it anywhere else. I want you to sit with that word, exact. Because that word is the entire reason my wife stood up in a conference room in front of an arbitrator and told him I'd never made anything of myself, and I want you to understand the full shape of what she said, because she knew better. She had been standing in that pole barn 19 years earlier when I cut the first working prototype of a valve seal that nobody else in the country could machine to the tolerance I could hold. She looked at it in my hand and said, "So, it's a little metal donut. Can we afford groceries this week?" Let me back up and tell you about Diane. Diane Marsh, before she was Diane Combs, was the sharpest, most put-together woman I had ever laid eyes on when I met her at my cousin's wedding in 2001. I was 41. I'd spent my whole adult life either under a truck or bent over a lathe, and I did not know the first thing about how to carry myself at a wedding reception with cloth napkins. Diane worked the room like she'd built it herself. She sold commercial insurance to small businesses around the county, and she was good at it, the kind of good where people called her back just because they liked talking to her. I was, and I say this without any shame at all, completely out of my depth around her. We got married 11 months later. She kept selling insurance. I kept machining parts in the barn behind the house we bought together. For a long time, that arrangement worked fine. Because, for a long time, what I did in that barn didn't look like much of anything to anyone standing outside it. A guy in coveralls, making metal parts, coming in for dinner with grease under his fingernails no matter how hard he scrubbed. Diane was the one who showed up clean to things. She was the one people asked about at church. I was Diane's husband. He's got a little machine shop. That phrase followed me around for years. And honestly, for a long time, it didn't bother me. Because I loved the work more than I loved being talked about. The trouble started slow, the way it usually does, right around the time the work stopped being small. In 2007, I filed my first patent on a ceiling design I'd been chasing for 2 winters. Late at night, after the shop closed, just me and a notebook and a lot of coffee. It wasn't glamorous. It was a valve component for high-pressure hydraulic systems. The kind of thing that sounds boring until you understand that the entire oil and gas industry and half the aerospace industry has a version of this exact problem, and mine solved it better and cheaper than anything on the market. The licensing money that first year was modest, a few $1,000s from one regional manufacturer. Diane asked me what it was for. I told her. She said, "So somebody's paying you rent on an idea? That's cute." That was 2007. By 2012, I'd been granted 6 more patents on variations of the same underlying design, applied to different industries, and I had a licensing arrangement with 2 manufacturers that most machinists I knew would have called a small miracle. To Diane, none of it registered as anything beyond a hobby that occasionally paid a little. I was still the guy in the barn. She was the one whose name people knew at the Rotary Club. She wasn't wrong that I was hard to bring to a dinner party. She wasn't wrong that she carried the social weight of our marriage on her own back for years. She was wrong, dead wrong, about what the work in that barn was actually worth. By 2016, I had 11 granted patents and a licensing relationship with a company that supplied components to 3 of the 5 largest oil field service outfits in the country. 3 of my seal designs had gone into standard use in equipment that was now running in basins from Texas to North Dakota. I still didn't spend money like it meant anything. I put almost every dollar back into better equipment for the shop, and whatever was left, I put with a financial advisor in town who I trusted the way I trust a good micrometer, because he was precise and he didn't waste my time. In the spring of 2020, right when everybody else's world was falling apart, mine quietly got a lot bigger. A licensing renegotiation with the largest of those manufacturers restructured my royalty as a straight percentage of units shipped, instead of the flat annual fee we'd had before, and their volume that year, because of a supply shortage everywhere else, went through the roof. I came home one evening in June of that year and told Diane what the quarterly statement said. She looked at the number on the page for a long moment. She said, "Is that a typo?" I said, "No." She said, "From your little donuts?" I said, "From the licensing agreement covering those parts. Yes, that's the number." She sat there looking at it, and then she said the sentence I want to tell you exactly, word for word, because it's the sentence that made 19 years snap into focus for me all at once. She said, "Well, I guess it was worth putting up with the smell of that barn all this time." Putting up with the smell of the barn. I sat across from my own wife and thought about every Sunday she'd sighed at me for coming in from work an hour late for dinner because a part had to be right before I could walk away from it. I thought about every time she'd introduce me to somebody new with that little laugh. "He's got a machine shop. Don't ask him to explain it. You'll be there all night." I thought about every conversation at every family gathering where she'd steered the topic away from me because nobody wants to hear about tolerances, Russell, putting up with the smell of the barn. I said, "Diane, I need to think about something." She said, "What?" I said, "Whether we still want the same life." She looked at me with a look I hadn't seen from her before. Or maybe I had seen it before and just never read it right. It wasn't surprise. It was the look of somebody doing arithmetic in her head. I didn't know yet what she was calculating, but I started paying attention in a way I hadn't been, and in my experience, paying attention is where everything that matters starts. The next year and a half is a stretch I need to walk through carefully, because things shifted, not all at once, but gradually, the way things do, once an imbalance gets named out loud, even sideways, and both people know it's been named, and neither one knows quite what to do about it yet. Diane got interested in the shop in a way she never had before. She started asking questions about the patents, how they were structured, whether they were in my name alone or in some kind of business entity. She came out to the barn a couple times, which she hadn't done in years, and she was warm and engaged and asked good questions, because Diane, when she wanted to be, could charm a snake out of its skin. But I also noticed, and I notice things for a living, that the questions had a particular shape to them. Not how does this work, but what happens to this if something happened to you. Not are you proud of this, but whose name is on the licensing checks. I don't react fast to new information. I'm a toolmaker. I record what I see, and I wait to see if the pattern holds. In February of 2022, Diane told me over coffee on a Saturday morning that she wanted a divorce. She said it plain and calm, like she'd rehearsed it, which she probably had. She said, "I haven't been happy in a long time, Russell. I think you know that too." I said, "I hear you." She said, "I want this to be clean. I think we can work out something fair to both of us." I said, "What does fair look like to you?" She said, "The house, half of everything in the accounts, and a piece of whatever those patents keep bringing in, going forward." I said, "We should both get lawyers." She said, "Obviously." I called my attorney that same afternoon. Man named Walt Prescott, been handling my licensing contracts and the occasional supplier dispute since 2009. He's about 62, doesn't waste a word, and has never once in 13 years told me what I wanted to hear instead of what was true. I laid it out for him, told him what Diane wanted, told him about the royalties. He went quiet on his end of the line for a second. Then he said, "Russell, the royalty stream is the whole ballgame here. Whose name are the patents under?" I said mine, all 11 of them. He said, "And the licensing income runs through what?" I said an LLC I set up back in 2011, Combs Precision Engineering. He said, "Who owns the LLC?" I said, "I do, entirely, always have." He said, "I need to ask you something and I need the straight answer." I said, "Always." He said, "Did Diane contribute to the design work, the engineering, any of it, in a way you could point to on paper?" I thought about 19 years. About Diane in every room I couldn't work, about every insurance policy she sold and every dinner party she carried, running right alongside my work without ever once touching it. I said no, she didn't. Walt said, "Good. Then we've got ground to stand on. But Russell, I want you ready for something. When the other side finds out the real size of what you've built, the offer to keep things clean has a way of turning into something else entirely." Diane's attorney was a man named Dale Whitfield. I want to describe him fair, because fair matters. 51 years old, sharp reputation in this part of the state for divorces where one side had money the other side wanted a piece of. Expensive, aggressive, and, according to Walt, he had a favorite play in cases, exactly like mine. He'd argue that Diane's role, running the social side of our life, managing appearances, keeping us presentable in a community that judged a man by more than his hands, had freed me up to do whatever it was I did out in that barn. That her contribution wasn't technical, but it was foundational, the kind that entitles a spouse to a real share of what got built on top of it. Walt called it a creative argument, said it had worked for Whitfield before, and whether it worked again depended entirely on the judge, and on how well Whitfield could back it up with something other than Diane's own account of things. I said, "Can he back it up here?" Walt said, "That's exactly what we're going to spend the next several months finding out." What came next tested my patience worse than any stubborn piece of tool steel ever has. Depositions, financial disclosures, requests for documents going back years, the whole slow grinding machine of a contested divorce, which takes everything a man has spent his life building and puts it in front of strangers whose job isn't to find the truth, it's to find whatever argument helps their client. Diane's position, through Whitfield, was that she'd been the foundation our whole marriage stood on, and that anything that grew out of that foundation belonged to both of us. She was asking for the house, 45% of every account we held jointly, and 30% of all royalty income going forward, forever, on every patent granted during the marriage. I sat in Walt's office reading Whitfield's filing, and thought back to that Saturday morning in the kitchen, Diane looking at the royalty number and saying it was worth putting up with the smell of the barn. I understood now exactly what she'd been calculating. I said, "Walt, what's our position?" He said, "Our position is that the patents are your work and your work alone, that the LLC keeps the royalty income separate from marital property in a way that'll hold up, and that Diane's contribution, real as it was socially, doesn't legally entitle her to a share of intellectual property she had no hand in creating." He said, "It's a strong hand, Russell, but I want to prepare you. Whitfield's going to make this personal. When the legal argument gets thin, the human story becomes the whole strategy. He's going to put Diane on the stand, and she's going to tell 19 years of marriage to a man who was distant and hard to talk to, and impossible to explain at a dinner party, and how she held the whole thing together through loyalty while you were out in that barn. And that story, in front of the right person, can move things in ways the paperwork alone can't." I said, "Let her tell it." Walt looked at me. I said, "Let her tell every last bit of it, because I've been watching for 19 years, and I've got my own record of what happened in that marriage, and it's documented." Walt said, "What do you mean documented?" I said, "I mean I'm a machinist, Walt. I keep records the same way I keep tolerances. I've got shop logs going back to 1994. I've got the file on every patent application, every draft, every revision, every correspondence with the patent office. I've got the licensing negotiations and the royalty statements and every dollar I ever moved since the day we got married. I said, I've got the record of who built what, and it's complete. Walt sat back in his chair. He said, How complete? I said, 31 years complete. Now, if you're still riding along with me, and any of this is hitting close to home, do me a favor and hit that like button. Because what happened in that conference room the day of the hearing took every single thing I just told you to set up, and I want you to see the whole thing. Subscribe if you haven't yet. Stick with me. We're almost to the door. The hearing landed on a Thursday morning in September, in front of an arbitrator instead of a courtroom judge. Because our case had been routed to binding arbitration under a clause in an agreement neither Diane nor I had thought twice about years earlier. I want to tell you what I knew walking in, and what I didn't, because both matter. What I knew was that Walt had built a response about as thorough as I've ever seen. He'd brought in a forensic accountant who'd gone through the LLC's entire financial history and put together a report Walt called the cleanest work he'd seen from an expert witness in 20 years of practice. He'd brought in a patent attorney who'd reviewed every one of my 11 applications and could speak, line by line, to the fact that every claim and every filing traced back to my hand, and nobody else's. He had statements ready from 2 manufacturers I'd licensed to, who could speak plainly to the value of what I'd built and the fact that I'd built it alone. What I didn't know was what Diane was going to say up there. Walt had warned me she'd been coached hard, that Whitfield had spent real time preparing her testimony, that she was going to lay out 19 years, in a way built to make me look small in front of a stranger, with the power to decide what I kept. I said, Let her. He said, Russell, I need you dead still when she's talking. Whatever comes out of her mouth, you don't react. You look at me, or you look at the arbitrator, but you do not react. I said, I understand. He said, I mean it, Russell. I said, Walt, I've spent 19 years not reacting to things Diane says. I've had the practice. He almost laughed. He said, Good. Use it now. We got to the office building downtown at 8:15. I wore the one good suit I own, the one I wear to trade shows when a manufacturer wants to shake my hand in front of a camera. Walt had his briefcase and his binder of exhibits, and the calm of a man who'd done everything preparation allows a person to do, and was ready for whatever the morning handed him. Whitfield was already out in the hallway when we walked up. He gave Walt a nod. He looked at me the way a man looks at something he's spent 8 months building a case against and already decided what it is. The hearing started at 9 sharp. The arbitrator was a retired judge named Harold Beckett, 68 years old, brought in specifically because both sides had agreed years back that his background made him a fair hand for exactly this kind of dispute. What neither Diane nor Whitfield seemed to know, or had bothered to check, was that before Beckett went to law school, he'd spent 6 years as a mechanical engineer for a manufacturer down in Evansville. I filed that away, the second Walt mentioned it to me in the hallway that morning. Whitfield opened strong, polished, strategic, the exact picture he'd been building for 8 months. The distant husband, the incomprehensible little shop, the wife who held together every part of the marriage that mattered to the outside world while he tinkered in a barn nobody else understood. He used the phrase, invisible partnership, more than once. He used the word sacrifice, like he'd rehearsed the weight of it. He was good. I'll give the man that. Walt's response was quiet and exact. Exhibit by exhibit. The forensic accountant's findings, the patent attorney's report, the manufacturer letters, building the real picture the same careful way. I've built every part I've ever machined, one precise cut at a time. Then Whitfield called Diane up. She was composed. She'd always known how to be exactly right in a room. That never changed about her. She answered the early questions clean and clear, with the kind of detail a person has when they've rehearsed. She described our marriage accurately enough on the surface. The late nights I spent in the barn, the dinners I missed, the family gatherings she carried on her own, while I stayed home chasing a tolerance I couldn't let go of. None of that was a lie. That's what made it hard to sit through. Every surface fact was true. It was the meaning she hung on those facts, where things came apart. And then Whitfield asked her the question he'd clearly built the whole morning around, and Diane answered it with a conviction I could see she genuinely believed. He said, Mrs. Combs, in your own words, Tell the arbitrator what your husband has actually accomplished in this marriage and what he's contributed to your life together. Diane looked at Beckett. She looked past Whitfield, out toward the window. She did not look at me. She said, Judge, my husband is a man who spent 19 years in a pole barn making metal parts. He never built anything anybody in the real world would recognize. Everything that mattered in our life, I built. He's a hobbyist with a workshop, not a provider, not a builder of anything real. The room went still. I looked at Beckett. Beckett looked back at me, and right there I saw it. The thing I told you about at the start. Because Harold Beckett, 6 years a mechanical engineer before he ever picked up a law book, he was looking at the man across the table with the expression of somebody who'd just spotted a detail that didn't match the story he'd been handed. He set down his pen. He picked it back up. He looked over at Whitfield. He said, Counselor, I don't think you've read the exhibit list. Whitfield said, Your Honor, sir, I've reviewed the full financial disclosure. Beckett said, I'm asking whether you understand what's actually in Exhibit 14. Whitfield reached for his laptop. He opened it. He started scrolling, and I watched his hands. They started shaking before he'd found the page. I want to slow down here, because this is the moment. Everything before it was built to get here, and I want to give you these next several minutes the way they deserve. Beckett said, Counselor, I'm going to call a 15-minute recess. I'd suggest you use it to get familiar with your own client's exhibits. When we come back, I've got questions. He stood and walked out through the side door. Whitfield closed his laptop slow. He looked over at Diane. Something crossed his face I hadn't seen on a lawyer before, the look of a man realizing the whole foundation of his case had just cracked, not quietly, but right out loud, in front of the person deciding the outcome. Diane said, Quiet. What is it? Whitfield said, just as quiet. We need to talk, right now. I sat next to Walt at our table. He leaned over and said, Lo, what just happened? I said, Beckett was a mechanical engineer before he was a judge. Walt looked at me. I said, He recognized my name. Walt sat back in his chair. He said, Russell. I said, Yes. He said, Did you know that about him going in? I said, You told me yourself, in the hallway this morning. I filed it. Walt looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen off him in 13 years of working together. Not quite disbelief. More like a man who's practiced law 3 decades watching something unfold that he hadn't engineered and couldn't have, and that had just taken the morning completely out of Whitfield's hands. He said, What exactly does Beckett know? I said, Exhibit 14 is the licensing agreement with Redstone Fluid Systems. That seal design got written up 2 years back in a trade journal that goes out to just about every mechanical engineer still active in this region, because it solved a leak problem that had been costing operators money for a decade. If Beckett still reads that journal, and a lot of engineers who go onto the bench keep one foot in the field, he's going to know that part, and he's going to know my name. Walt said, And the other 10 patents? I said, If he's looking right now, every one of them is public record. Granted patents, licensing agreements filed with the state, industry write-ups, all of it's sitting there for anybody who bothers to look. Walt said, Which an attorney, building a case against you, should have looked at. I said, Yes. He said, Whitfield didn't do any of that. I said, Diane's account of me was apparently all the research he thought he needed. Walt glanced across the room at Whitfield, who was now leaned in close to Diane, talking fast and low, and neither one of them looked happy. Walt said, He built his whole case on the word of a woman who just called you a hobbyist. I said, He did. Walt said, And never checked it against the record. I said, He did not. Walt sat quiet a second, then said, Russell, when we go back in, let me carry it. I said, That's what I hired you for. The recess ran 20 minutes. When Beckett came back, he had a legal pad in front of him covered in his own handwriting, and he took his time settling into his chair. He looked at Whitfield and said, Counselor, did you get a chance to review the material? Whitfield said, Yes, sir. Beckett let a silence sit there longer than a room like that usually allows. Whitfield said, Sir, I'd like to request a short continuance so my client's team can revisit the evidentiary record, Beckett said. I imagine you would. Denied. He set his pen down flat. He said, I've sat on cases like this for 11 years now. Business owners, tradesmen, professionals of every stripe, and I want to be precise about one thing this morning. The characterization your client gave this court, that her husband is a hobbyist who's never built anything real, does not square with a public record showing 11 granted patents, an active licensing relationship generating royalty income that puts most of the disputes I see in this chair to shame, and a seal design specifically that I am personally familiar with, because I read the trade press that covered it, back when I still kept my engineering license current. He paused. He said, "I'm not ruling on the merits of the petitioner's financial claims here today. That's what these proceedings exist for. What I am saying is that the factual foundation under those claims, specifically what's been represented to this court about the respondent's actual body of work, needs serious reconsideration before we go any further." He looked at Diane. He said, "Mrs. Combs, I'm going to give you the chance to revisit any testimony you've given this morning, now that the full record of your husband's work is in front of everyone in this room. You have that right." Diane's face did something in that moment I hadn't seen it do in 19 years together. Every bit of composure she owned left her all at once, and not in anger, in the particular look of somebody who built an entire argument on ground they were sure was solid and just found out, in front of a stranger with the power to decide the outcome, that it wasn't. She looked at Whitfield. He didn't look back at her. She looked at me, for the first time all morning. I looked back at her and thought about that kitchen table in 2020, the royalty statement, the smell of the barn. I didn't say a word. I just held her gaze until she looked away first. What happened over the next month is worth telling straight, because how it settled matters as much as that morning did. Whitfield asked for and got a 3-week continuance. In those 3 weeks, the full weight of my actual record, the 11 patents, the licensing agreements, the royalty structure, the value the forensic accountant had already laid out plainly, forced a complete rebuild of Diane's position. The claim on future royalties, in perpetuity, got dropped entirely. Walt had said all along it was never going to survive scrutiny, and the accountant's report had already made that plain. What the continuance really produced was Whitfield coming to terms with the fact that his whole strategy, built around Diane's account of an ordinary man she'd propped up for years, could not stand next to the actual record of what that man had built with his own 2 hands. The settlement, reached the following month, gave Diane the house. She'd picked out the paint colors, planted the garden beds, lived in it for going on 16 years, and it was hers, in the way a place becomes yours after that long. She got an equitable share of the accounts we'd built together during the marriage, the ones that were genuinely joint. Walt fought hard on the definition of joint, and that fight mattered. She got nothing from the patents, nothing from the LLC, nothing from the royalty stream. 31 years of one man's hands and one man's mind had built that, and the record of it was too complete to argue otherwise. I moved into a small rental across town, while the paperwork on the house went through. I sat in it that first night with a cup of coffee and an old shop notebook, thinking about what had just gotten settled and what hadn't. Some things don't settle in a month or in a year. What eventually settles isn't the anger or the grief or the particular sting of hearing your own wife call you a hobbyist in front of a stranger deciding your future. What settles, slow and never all the way complete, is understanding how 2 people can share a house for 19 years and end up holding 2 entirely different pictures of what was happening inside it. Diane hadn't been lying about what she saw. She'd been limited by what she was able to see. She read the world through how things looked from the outside, through who got noticed at the Rotary Club and who got talked about at church. And I, out in that barn with my hands and my patents and my 11 problems solved and filed and licensed, was next to invisible through that lens. She looked at me for 19 years and saw a man with a hobby. That wasn't cruelty on her part. It was a failure of sight, and I'll own my half of that failure too, because I never once found the words to make what I did out there make sense to the person sleeping down the hall from it. I've thought about that a long while now, and then I went back out to the barn and got started on the next design. I want to talk to you plain before I let you go tonight. If you've ever built something real that the people closest to you couldn't see for what it was, I need you to hear this. The fact that they couldn't see it isn't proof it wasn't real. It's proof of how far apart 2 kinds of understanding can sit from each other. The work is real. 11 patents sitting in the federal record are real. The The seal design running in wellheads and pipelines from here to the Gulf Coast, keeping equipment from failing, and keeping people safe, who never once heard my name. That's real. None of it needed Diane to believe in it to be true. What needed Diane to see it was a conference room, and a retired engineer turned arbitrator, and one morning where the gap between the story she'd told for 19 years and the truth of what I'd actually built came out into the light in front of everybody in that room at the same time. That wasn't revenge. I want to be straight with you about that. I didn't get 1 ounce of pleasure out of watching her face when Beckett read that exhibit list back to her. I didn't enjoy watching Whitfield's hands shake. Those weren't wins. They were corrections, plain and simple, a record getting set right after being wrong a long time. If there's a word at all for the revenge in this, it's the 11 patents themselves. 31 years in that barn. Problems solved that made real machines run better, and real people safer, whether anybody at the dinner table ever understood a word of it. That's the only kind of getting even that actually lasts. If this one meant something to you, hit that share button right now, and hit like, and subscribe if you haven't already, and drop me a comment down below. Tell me about something you built with your own 2 hands, that the people closest to you never once looked twice at. I read every single one of them. I'll see you in the next one.